A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So tausend Schabbos at the Skizzar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode about marriage trends in Eastern European Jewish history of the 19th century has been sponsored by the Shidduch Institute, who is encouraging each and every member of the wider Jewish community to fill out an easy and quick survey about shidduchim and matchmaking in order to gain a better understanding of the machinations of shidduchim in the North American Orthodox community and the challenges that we are facing within that system. This is the only way that a solution can be found is by gathering real data through this survey, which the general public fills out, and then have it analyzed to understand the challenges. And there's something that I want to say, and I say this as an outsider, as an objective outsider, I hope. I live in Israel, so I'm an outsider, because in Israel, to the best of my knowledge, the Shidduch crisis does not exist at all. To the best of my knowledge, does not exist. But in the United States, there's a huge debate. Is there a Shidduch crisis? If there is, then what the scope of it is, and what are the causes of it, and what are the solutions, and everyone's got their solution, etc., yada, 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 yada. But there's a broader point here, and as a community, we are generally very rich in opinions, in editorials, in solutions, in analysis, but we're very, 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 very short on hard data on any social issue, on any religious issue, on any educational issue. We're always rich in opinions, very short on numbers, on statistics. And that's too bad, because we'd actually get a lot further if we approached social issues and we actually went out to the field and crunched out some numbers in many, many different areas, in political, religious issues, educational issues, and all kinds of things. This is not the time and place to speak about that. But in regards to the Shidduch crisis, the Shidduch Institute is the ones who are going out ahead and doing exactly that. And they've earned my respect and support because they're doing that. They're one of the first Orthodox Jewish organizations to acknowledge that the way to approach the challenge is first and foremost by obtaining the hard and cold data through a very sophisticated survey, which will illuminate the real picture of what's going on in the Shidduch world for the very first time. And that will enable us to get past the noise and opinions and editorials and come back with some numbers, with some facts, with some real data. It's amazing. The only one little catch is that people have to actually go ahead and fill it out. Fill out the survey, submit it back so the cumulative answers can be analyzed properly and professionally. So it's essential that everyone listening to Jewish History Soundbites right now, go ahead and fill it out. It takes a couple of minutes. Share the link with all your family and friends and contacts and encourage them to fill it out as well. It's important that it gets as many numbers as possible. By the way, there's another thing here. If a couple of thousand people go ahead and fill it out as a result of this ad on Jewish History Soundbites, it will be a very concrete way to show sponsors of this podcast how much market clout Jewish History Soundbites has. So it's also a great service to Jewish History Soundbites, not only to the Shidduch world and the general society. The link will obviously be posted in the show notes as well, and it is shidduchinstitute.com/survey. So that's about the Shidduch crisis that we've all heard about and all talked about and all come to our brilliant conclusions. But everyone's got their own opinions about it. So, and everyone knows that their theory is the only theory that's correct. So now we can actually find out what it is. The Shidduch Institute is working with top-tier data scientists to develop this customized survey for the community, and the survey will help pinpoint exactly what the main issues are for singles today in the Shidduch world. And obviously, the survey is just a means to an end. Once the survey is completed, it's going to be analyzed and utilized to produce a solution with a broad consensus and with the proper resources to do so. And once they have the accurate information, social change and social improvement is not only possible, it is almost inevitable. So go to shidduchinstitute.com and fill out the survey, send the link to your friends and family, and have them fill out the survey too. And of course, the sponsorship is related to today's topic, marriage trends in Jewish history. And why is this a great topic? This is, by me, almost an ideal topic. I wish more Jewish History Soundbites episodes would be about social issues, about social history, not social issues only, social history. Jewish History Soundbites is very heavy on rabbis and heroes, not enough on broad trends, broad social issues about the Jewish people and the times and the context. I wish more episodes were about it. The three criteria I would like as an ideal episode are not specifically about rabbis, that it's very broad, and that it be social. I could do 100 topics like this if there would be enough sponsors interested. So sponsors out there, I obviously love rabbis and love it that you love rabbis too, but if we could have a little more diversity, like such as this episode, and this is a great topic, and it's going to be one of my favorite episodes. So obviously we can't do this without mentioning rabbis altogether. We got to start off by mentioning rabbis. So I actually remember, one of the things they talk about in the Shidduch crisis, Shabbos table conversations, is if the marrying a spouse who's older. So if boys would marry girls who are older, I think that's one of the solutions, or I don't know, one of the issues involved. So I remember when I was Menachem Avel, Reb Aaron Leib Steinman many years ago, it was like cool to be able to say that, that's the reason I went. In other words, I had no idea who Reb Steinman was at the time, but I knew that it would be cool to say afterwards, hey, I just went to be Menachem Avel Reb Steinman, so that's why I went then. But I did get a good nugget of information. He was sitting Shiva for his wife many years ago. I think it's about 20-something years ago. I don't remember the exact year. And they mentioned there in the Shiva house that his wife was 3 years older than him. So there you go, a good historical tidbit. Reb Steinman's wife was 3 years older than him. I think I recall reading in the biography of Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, or maybe it was another related article. I don't recall exactly. But I believe that Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch also, his wife was significantly older than him, and I think there were other famous rabbis as well. So it's not unheard of to have the lopsided marriage age there. I don't even know why it's considered lopsided, but that's another story. Either way, I wanted to open the topic about the story that I very often say in front of Block 10 in Auschwitz concentration camp, Auschwitz 1. Today it's a museum. When I bring the groups there in Poland. And I recently read an article in the Mishpacha magazine relating marriage, shidduch age issues and crisis to fertility challenges, and how this organization is bringing the two together. and works on both communal challenges together. So this story that I'm about to say that took place in Block 10 in Auschwitz is a great opening to the marriage topic, the shidduch topic, but it's closely related to fertility as well. And I very often say it's a very powerful story. There was a 16-year-old girl named Aliza Tsarfati from Saloniki in Greece, who was deported with her family and community to Auschwitz in 1942, 1943. Almost all Jews from Saloniki were murdered by the Nazis in Auschwitz in the gas chambers. She's one of the few who were selected, and she ends up in Block 10. Now, Block 10 was an infamous block in Auschwitz. In Auschwitz I, again, the medical experiments in Birkenau, in Auschwitz II Birkenau, were infamously headed by Mengele, Yosef Mengele. We're talking about a different place. Block 10 is in Auschwitz I. There was a team of SS doctors. One of the main ones was Dr. Klaus Klauberg and his team, his staff. And so there were two distinct operations. In any event, very often the medical experiments that were cruelly and awful cruelty and torture that were done by the Nazis on inmates in Auschwitz, very often Jewish inmates in Auschwitz, were done very often to make women infertile. And till today, Block 10 in the museum there is sealed. You don't go in with groups. You stand outside in respect to the horrible tortures that went on in that place. It's not a place for visitors. So Aliza Tsarfati is 16 years old, and she's taken to Block 10, where she's going to have this terrible surgery done to her. And the SS doctors actually had forced Jewish inmates who were physicians to work for them. They forced them to participate in the surgeries, to be their medical assistants. And there was an elderly German doctor in his 60s, I believe, whose name was Dr. Maximilian Samuel, who was a secular, assimilated German Jew, not religious at all, but he was a very prestigious doctor before the war in Germany, and he is forced by the Nazis to work in. What's even more bothersome about the story is that if you look up Dr. Samuel, you'll find that many online accuse him of being a collaborator, when in fact we'll see in this story he was a hero. He was not a collaborator at all. One of those issues of besmirching Jews who were found in very, very challenging, extenuating circumstances under Nazi oppression. In any event, so this young lady, Aliza Tsarfati, is being experimented on, done this terrible surgery to, and Klauberg is performing the surgery, and Dr. Maximilian Samuel is there as well. And then there's an air raid siren. Presumably from the Russian Air Force or whoever, Soviet Air Force, the Red Army, whatever it was. There was a air raid siren, and it's 1943. So the SS leaves, the SS staff, Klauberg and his staff leave the room and go into a bomb shelter and order Dr. Samuel to continue the surgery on his own. The inmates don't get to go into a bomb shelter when there's an air raid siren. And she, who's obviously awake during the surgery, she starts to yell and scream and curse this doctor. She says, "You collaborator, you murderer. Look at me, I'm a young girl, and you're destroying my future. You're killing, I'm never going to be able to have children. I'm never going to, what are you doing? You're just a Nazi collaborator." And she's going on at him as he's continuing the surgery, and he is silent. He doesn't respond. When he's finally finished the surgery, and the SS are heading back into the room after the air raid siren, as he's leaving the room, he glances at her and says to her quietly, "One day you'll remember me." And she goes on, and later on in the war, she meets another Jew from Saloniki in a sub-camp of Auschwitz. A fascinating story. Ovadia Baruch, who's being beaten by a Nazi SS guard for having possessed contraband. He was smuggling something, food or whatever it was. He was trying, they're starving there, and as he's being beaten, he's screaming in Greek, and you don't really hear that often in Greek in Auschwitz. So she heard that, and this is a sub camp. It wasn't exactly as separate the genders as the Auschwitz main camp, and she contacts him, and it's this beautiful romantic story. In Auschwitz, they promise each other they're going to survive, and they're going to marry each other after the war, and miraculously the two of them do survive, even though their entire families are wiped out, and they meet in Saloniki after the war. The only survivors of their families, and they're going to get married now. But she says she backs out of the agreement. She says, we're not getting married. I can't have children. You lost your whole family. You need to build a new family. You need to have children. And I was experimented on in Block 10, and obviously I'm infertile now, and we can't get married. See, again, it's a beautiful romantic story. He says, I don't need the children. I want you, and we're going to get married anyway. She doesn't believe him, so she makes him sign in the ksuba an extra clause that he doesn't mind that they're never going to have children. So he signs in the ksuba this clause that he agrees to marry her even though they're never going to have children. They move to Israel, and lo and behold, she's not feeling well one day. About a year or two later, she goes to the doctor in the socialist Kupat Cholim at the time, and the impatient Israeli doctor says, what do you want from me? You're not feeling well. Of course you're not feeling well. You're 3 months pregnant. And she jumps off the table and says, it's impossible, doctor. I was experimented on in Block 10. So he says, I don't care about your Block 10. You are 3 months pregnant. And they go home, and sure enough, a half a year later, she has a healthy baby boy. And she goes back to hear what Dr. Maximilian Samuel, who actually was killed by the Nazis a couple of months after this story had happened, and no one knows why he was killed, but he definitely was. He did not survive, but he had told her, one day you'll remember me, and she remembered him. He had fudged the surgery. Because the SS wasn't looking over his shoulder, he had risked his life to make the surgery not happen in a way that it would not damage her fertility prospects after the war, which is an incredible thing, because if you think about it, people in Auschwitz were struggling to survive. They were not thinking about building a Jewish future. And here this doctor is not just thinking about survival, he's thinking about how are the Jewish people going to be rebuilt after the war? How are people going to have children after the war? Not just surviving the war, but how is the Jewish people going to be rebuilt? And they had a second child, and of course when Ovadia Baruch, who I heard the story from in a video testimony, the camera goes to a picture of his family today when he's relating the story. And you see the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, this incredible family that's all with this foresight in Block 10 in Auschwitz of this happening, that they should be able to continue. So that's a story of marriage and fertility in Auschwitz. And that is a great way to get into this topic. And Professor Shaul Stempfer has great research on this marriage trends in pre-war Jewish Eastern Europe, and I'm going to base it off of him because we have this image of, Tevye the milkman, matchmaker, make me a match. That's the image most people have of shidduchim in the shtetl in Eastern Europe, richly painted by Shalom Aleichem, when really it was a much more nuanced picture. What exactly was going on? What were the ages they got married? What was the difference in the socioeconomic status, the religious, the demographics, the role of the matchmaker, of the shadchan, and the age of marriage? If you go back all the way to the Middle Ages in Ashkenaz, there's a famous Taisvis in Kiddushin, a really historical Taisvis, and Daf Mem Aleph in Kiddushin, that describes how fathers would marry off their daughters at a young age and he bemoans the state of the exile, and the pain of the exile is very apparent in that Taisvis, about how they're concerned that they won't have a dowry to give their child if they don't marry her off young. And you have to run to marry off your children because who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what's lurking around the corner? What kind of tragedy is going to await? So therefore you marry them off at a very young age. There's another element of commercial marriages to forge business connections, which was very common in the Sephardic diaspora world of the 16th and 17th centuries, that the children of families, of business families, of two commercial families, that they would arrange that their children should marry each other. I don't think the children were consulted in these marriages, to forge a very good business connection. That was quite common for centuries. But I'm going to focus on on Charles Stempfer's article, which he's talking about the 19th century in Russia, in the Pale of Settlement. He has lots of other articles which talk about all kinds of social issues in the Jews of Eastern Europe at that time: divorce, remarriage, love and romance in marriage, shadchanim, the economics of marriage, changes in marriage trends, comparing Jewish and non-Jewish marriages. Was Jewish families matriarchal or patriarchal, or neither, or both? And other similar topics, which are all fascinating, not to mention a host of other topics which he's researched, but he's a great researcher. Today we're going to, with the remaining time that we have, we're going to focus on the marriage age in Eastern Europe in the 19th century and how it reflects social and religious changes, as well as a general understanding of the context of the socioeconomic backgrounds of the different strata of Jewish society at the time, and how that impacted marriageable age, because we're going to go into the class system. I'm not going to try to sound Marxist here, but the Jews in Eastern Europe, especially in the 19th century, before urbanization, before the Industrial Revolution, it was a very, very clear difference in classes between the Sheine Yidden and the Proste Yidden. The elite of the shtetl society were the learned and the wealthy. The rabbis, the Torah scholars, and the wealthy businessmen and the Rashi Kahal, the ones who ran the Kahal in which controlled all of Jewish life in Eastern Europe at the time, in the early 19th century, before that changed. And then there what was known as, those were the Sheine Yidden, and then there's the Proste Yidden, which were the masses, the artisans, the craftsmen, the laborers. A large percentage of them were illiterate, the ones who went to work at a young age, and this was the majority of the Jewish population, but they had very little say in what went on in the Kahal. There's just give a little summary of Stempfer's findings, and I will actually cite directly from his article at times. So if I sound more articulate in the coming minutes, it's not me, it's from Professor Stempfer himself. He talks about the premature, the early marriage, which was common in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the modern period, even before it's the partitions of Poland. In other words, before it's Tsarist Russia, when it's still the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Polish Kingdom. And we're talking about how it is perceived as quite common to get married at 12, 13 years old. And it goes into the 17th, 18th, 19th century. There's in Shilas and Shuvas, in Halachic Responsum, it talks about these premature marriages that happens. Young boys, young girls are getting married. There, he brings a tshuva there of Reb Shmuel of Amdur in the 1700s, and he says, in some communities it is customary today to be lenient and to allow the marriage of young boys already before the beginning of their 13th year. In other words, before their bar mitzvah, even though according to the Talmud this is clearly forbidden. So that indicates that early marriage was practiced. Talking about early as in young teenagers, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. It was practiced in Poland, but it also suggests that it wasn't the standard everywhere, because it's still news in the Shilas Achuvas farm. The first autobiographies we have of Eastern European Jews from the 18th century also document the practice. The famous autobiography of Solomon Maimon, he wrote about his broken engagement and his subsequent marriage at the age of 11. There are references to early marriage that can be found in communal records, in the Vad of Lita, of the Lithuanian Jewish Council, there's a takana, an enactment of 1761 that says it is absolutely forbidden for a male to marry before the age of 13 years and a day, and for a female before the age of 12 years and a day. In other words, after that it is permitted. And the fact that it was necessary to make such a rule suggests that there were Jews who married off their children even younger than 12 and 13. And that's what non-Jewish observers of Jewish society found as well. They saw that was characteristic of the Jewish community, that 12 and 13-year-olds were getting married in the 18th and 19th centuries in the Jewish communities. It even came up as an issue to contend with, as a way to get the economic and cultural improvement of the Jews in Poland. So non-Jewish politicians suggested enacting laws making the age of marriage later, so that there should be a minimum age of marriage. So that was actually contemplated as towards ameliorating the situation of the Jews in Poland at the time. And that's what historians of Polish Jewish history made as an assumption, that Jews in Poland in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries all got married young, at 12, 13, 14, and 15 years old. That was characteristic of the Jews. Emanuel Ringelblum, the famous Polish Jewish historian, he wrote an article on the topic, and he wrote that Jews at that time would marry at a very early age, much younger than the general population. Isaac Schipper, the same thing. He said most Polish Jews during the 18th and 19th centuries were married by the age of 16. Other ones said even younger, 13-year-old boys, 12-year-old girls got married, sometimes even younger than that. Sometimes when there were panics sweeping through the Jewish communities, there was rumors that the government would be making laws against Jewish marriage, so they would marry off their children even at the age of 6, 7, and 8 years old, which was more rare, but it happened as well. So the perception was that the Jews in Eastern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries got married at a very, very young. The reality is different, and this is what Stemfer proves, is that it's not true. It's simply not true. The scope of these early marriages was quite limited, and he explains it in this class system of Jewish society. He says that in reality, very early marriage among Jews was limited in scope in the 18th and 19th centuries. Most Jews did not marry in their early teens, and many did so only in their 20s, which, hey, that's the custom today as well, so not much has changed. And the way he proves it is you have to understand, first of all, the numbers. Again, they crunched out the numbers, right? And he brings another scholarly article written by Jacob Goldberg in the 1980s, and he finds that it's actually not true that most were married when they were teenagers. He found that the population, only 20% of males were under the age of 20 were married. Only 40% of females under the age of 20 were married. So in almost every case of very early marriage, the young couple was supported by the parents of the girl, which is going to be a crucial part of the story. And this was called kest, it's famously called kest in Yiddish. That's the support of a son-in-law. So we need to know a little bit more about kest in order to understand that. So most kest givers, this is research done by the famous Jewish Marxist historian, actually a friend of Ringelblum, close friend of Ringelblum, Raphael Mailer, who colored all his research with the Marxist economic class division. So it's a bit colored, but he brings the numbers. And he shows that 2/3 of kest givers, in other words, fathers-in-law who were supporting sons-in-law in the shtetls in the Lublin area of the time period that he tested, he found that 2/3 of them were wealthy, were tax collectors. They're considered part of the heads of the community, the heads of the Kahal, and they were the wealthier members of the community. And this is obviously related to their economic condition. And the tax collectors were financially better off in the community, and they were the ones who were supporting young sons-in-law. the daughters of the poorer members of the community were marrying at a later age, and they were not getting, and their fathers were not supporting their husbands. And obviously there's an economic element here. So the young marriage was primarily limited to the wealthy members of the community. It also comes apparent in a very strange source that Stempfer brings, Yiddish folk songs. Yiddish folk songs deal with the challenges of shidduchim. And the context of these songs, meaning the finding a shidduch, and the context of these songs would indicate that these people were not 12 or 13-year-olds. In other words, the challenge of getting married, which already for older ones was among the where there was not, they were not yet married at 12 and 13. They were older. They were later teen years or early 20s. So that would again show that it wasn't universal. It wasn't that everyone was getting married when they were 12, 13 years old. There were plenty of people not married in their late teens or 20s, if there were all these Yiddish songs being composed about the challenges of finding a shidduch. So the main point is the strongest evidence for the claim that very early marriage was characteristic only of some Jews and not of all of them is that in almost every description of an early marriage, the boy is depicted as moving into the house of his father-in-law. He would live there, and the couple would receive financial support from his in-laws for the number of years of kest that he's supposed to get. During these years, what would the boy do, the young man do, the young married boy who's 12, 13 years old? He would devote most of his time to Torah study in the local Beis Medrash. And no young chassan went out at 12 or 13 years old to go earn a living. It is obvious that most Jewish fathers of young women were not able to extend support to their sons-in-law, and because they could not afford to. The cost of supporting a young Torah scholar who learned all day in the Beis Medrash was quite significant, and therefore most people could not afford to support a son-in-law. So supporting a son-in-law and his family were a luxury that only few could afford. And not only that, but most young men in the shtetl were not capable of learning Torah all day in a Beis Medrash. That was only for the few and for the scholarly elite. So premature marriage, this young marriage, was common in Eastern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, but only by the elite strata of society, only by the wealthy and learned, only by the Sheina Yidden, not by the Prasta Yidden. Most of the Jewish community, the Prasta Yidden, the simple masses, were unable to allow themselves this luxury of early marriage. They got married in their late teens or early 20s, and you have to understand how this looked in the Jewish community, right? So the parents of the young lady who's married assumed the responsibility for the financial support of the young couple. So they're the wealthy members of the community. And the young couple lives in the parents' house. And he goes to study in the local Beis Medrash. Right? This was the pattern of all those who got married young, which most people who got married did not do so. They went to work right away. That's because they got married later and they were poorer. Right? So we think about it in the social sense. The benefit of this public display, this young man who's going to study in the Beis Medrash. Everyone sees that he goes and studies in the Beis Medrash. Everyone knows that he's being supported by his father-in-law. Everyone knows that he's a young married man who can afford to study in the Beis Medrash all day because he has a father-in-law who's supporting him. So study in a Beis Medrash was a public demonstration of the father-in-law's economic stature, and also a public demonstration of his religious commitment, of that he loved Torah, that he loved supporting Torah. So now that raises his prestige in the community. He loves Torah, and he is wealthy. He can support a son-in-law in learning. And therefore, that was done in that strata of society. Everyone knew that. And you chose a scholar as a son-in-law, and this financial investment to support his Torah study was visible proof of his status in the community. And therefore you're part of the Sheina Yidden. You're the elite, both because you're scholarly and because you're wealthy. The lower class Jews delayed marriage, and the couple had to support themselves because they were not part of that strata of society. So that was a very part of the social context of the shtetl Jews of the 19th century. So that really explains. And that's also the thing of shadchanim. If we think about the role of the shadchanim were almost exclusively used only by the Sheina Yidden, only by the elite of society, only by the scholarly and wealthy, because you got a percentage. The shadchan got a percentage of the bride's dowry, between 0.8% and 2%. And if this was the dowry of the Prasta Yidden, of the lower classes of society, then it's not worth it for the shadchan. It would be meaningless. He would not even bother with it. And the Prasta Yidden made their shidduchim on their own. The shadchan was employed only by the wealthy in the community. And that's also another component to understand. So the reason, obviously, that the sources were skewed is because of the fact that most of the written records, autobiographies and biographies, are written by the elite, by the wealthy, about rabbis. They're written about rabbis, about Torah leaders, and therefore Torah leaders were always the ones who were supported by their fathers-in-law. So they're going to leave most of the written records, or by the wealthy, by the literate. The masses, half the time they were illiterate altogether. They're not going to leave written records. So we know obviously more about the elite of society. Now it disappears. Towards the end of the 19th century, this whole idea of getting married young completely disappears from the Jewish landscape. How does that happen so quickly? That's a very curious phenomenon. And we have the answer. It's answered by none other than the Chafetz Chaim himself. Because the financial elite of Eastern Europe starts to move away from the trend of showing off their wealth by supporting a young son-in-law studying Torah. They're adopting more Western trends. There's more secularization among the wealthy elite, even if it's not secularization, but it's at least they're less inclined to support a son-in-law who wants to study Torah, and therefore they're not going to marry off their daughters to that. So they're interested in young men who had a university education or European mannerisms, and European mannerisms didn't look so kindly upon 12 and 13-year-olds getting married, and especially not, being supported to study Torah afterwards. So the drop in the market value of yeshiva students leads directly to the sharp rise in the age of marriage until it reaches the marriage of the rest of Jewish society, what it had always been, either late teens, early 20s, and then even later. So the Chafetz Chaim points this out. He says that the rich, they used to be respectful to rabbis, and they desired that their daughters marry rabbis and to support them for a number of years at their table and to cover their expenses until they complete their Torah studies. However, they have ceased to do so. That's what the Chafetz Chaim writes, and that's why the Chafetz Chaim and others, the Alter Slabodka, B'tzikachan Inspector, B'Yisrael Salanter, and others went on to invent a new thing called the Kailul. The Kailul system is invented at the end of the 1800s to provide a financial basis for promising young Torah scholars, which is a substitute for rich fathers-in-law, because they are no longer supported. And thus, while we don't have explicit evidence for the rise of early marriage, we have a plausible explanation for its both appearance and the circumstances for its disappearance. At the end of the 19th century, where there was this rise in the age of marriage, even among the elite of society who had previously gotten married quite young. There's obviously lots more to cover in marriage trends in Jewish history, but we'll settle for this right now. Remember to fill out that survey at the Shidduch Institute, and this was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites at Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.